The silence in the nursery didn't just feel empty, it felt heavy, like it was holding its breath for 15 years. Detective Elias Thorne stared at the faded wallpaper, peeling at the corners like old skin. On the floor sat a wooden train set, frozen in mid-motion, exactly where 3-year-old Leo had left it. The afternoon he vanished into thin air. For a decade and a half, this room had been a shrine. For the police, it was a cold case. But this morning, a soil-stained envelope had been slid under the precinct door. Inside was a single, recent photograph of a teenage boy with a birthmark, shaped like a crescent moon, on his neck. The exact mark Elias had memorized from Leo's medical files. The town of Oakhaven had never forgotten. How could they? Children don't just evaporate from locked backyards. But the case had been buried under layers of bureaucratic dust and the crushing weight of no leads. Now, holding the photo, Elias felt the familiar, sharp pull of an obsession he thought he'd strangled years ago. He didn't go to his captain. He went to the mother. Clara was a ghost of a woman, her hair prematurely silver. When she saw the photo, she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply sat down on the porch swing and whispered. "He's grown into his father's eyes." "Clara," Elias said, his voice gravelly, "if this is him, it means he's been close. Close enough to be watched. Close enough to be photographed." The investigation didn't just reopen. It exploded. Elias started where the original detectives had failed. The old drainage tunnels that ran beneath the suburb. In the original files, they'd been marked as searched and cleared. But Elias noticed something. In the margins of the 2010 reporter signature from an officer who had retired just weeks after the disappearance. Officer Miller. Elias tracked Miller to a nursing home. The old man was frail, his mind drifting. But when Elias showed him the crescent moon birthmark, Miller's hands began to shake uncontrollably. "We didn't look deep enough," Miller rasped, his eyes darting to the door. "They told us to stop at the iron grate. They said the water was too high." "But the water wasn't high, Elias. The money was." The trail led Elias to the outskirts of the county, to a sprawling estate owned by the town's primary employer, the Blackwood family. They had donated millions to the police department over the years. They were the saviors of Oak. As Elias trespassed onto the Blackwood grounds, under the cover of a moonless night, the air turned cold. He found the secondary entrance to the tunnels, hidden behind a false stone wall in a garden shed. He climbed down, his flashlight cutting through the damp dark. The tunnels opened into a bunker that smelled of laundry detergent and iron. There was a bed, a bookshelf filled with worn-out children's stories, and a desk. On the desk sat a camera. "You shouldn't have come down here, detective." The voice was young. Elias spun around, his hand on his holster. Standing in the shadows was the boy from the photo. He looked like a masterpiece of Leo's father, but his eyes were wide, with a terrifying kind of Stockholm Syndrome devotion. "Leo," Elias whispered. "My name is Julian," the boy said, stepping into the light. "And my father is waiting for us upstairs. He saved me from the outside world," he told me. "The woman in the house with the train set was a monster who wanted to hurt me." The horror settled in Elias's gut-like lead. This wasn't just a kidnapping. It was a psychological reconstruction. The Blackwoods hadn't just taken a child. They had erased him and rewritten his soul. "Leo, look at me," Elias said, slowly unpinning his badge and holding it out. "Your mother has been waiting 15 years. She kept your room exactly as you left it. The wooden train, it's still on the floor." The boy flinched. The word train seemed to spark a flicker in his eyes, a brief, jagged memory of a sun-drenched afternoon and a mother's laughter. But the door behind the boy creaked open. Mr. Blackwood stood there, silhouetted by the light of the hallway, holding a silenced pistol. "Family is what you make it, detective," Blackwood said calmly. "And I've made a perfect one. It's a shame you're trying to break it." The first shot missed Elias's head by an inch, shattering a glass jar on the desk. Elias dived behind the concrete pillar, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Leo, run," Elias shouted. The boy stood frozen between his captor and his savior. Blackwood leveled the gun at Elias again, his finger tightening on the trigger. But Leo Julian didn't run. He lunged, not at Elias, but at the man he had called father for 15 years. He grabbed Blackwood's arm, his teenage strength fueled by a sudden, violent realization. The gun discharged into the ceiling. Elias moved, tackling Blackwood to the ground, the sound of the scuffle echoing through the hollow tunnels. It was messy, desperate, and loud. Within minutes, Elias had the zip ties on Blackwood's wrists. As the backup sirens finally wailed in the distance, Elias sat on the floor of the bunker, gasping for air. Leo was curled in the corner, shaking, staring at the photo Elias had dropped during the fight. "She's really waiting?" Leo asked, his voice cracking. "She never stopped," Elias said. The walk out of the tunnels was long, but as the sun began to rise over Oakhaven, the cold case wasn't just closed. It was breathing. Clara stood at the edge of the police tape as the ambulance arrived. When the boy stepped out, hesitant and blinking against the morning light, the 15-year silence finally broke. It wasn't a scream that filled the air, but a sob, the sound of a mother recognizing a ghost that had finally come home. Elias watched from a distance, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. The case was over, but the scars on the boy's mind would take another 15 years to heal. Still, as Leo reached out and touched his mother's silver hair, Elias knew that, for the first time in a decade, the nursery would no longer be a shrine. It would be a bedroom again. The reunion was only the beginning of a much darker excavation. While the town celebrated the miracle of Oakhaven, Elias Thorne knew that the basement bunker was just one room in a house built on lies. He spent the next 72 hours in the precinct's archives, fueled by black coffee and a burning suspicion that the Blackwoods hadn't acted alone. A kidnapping of this scale, lasting 15 years in a small town, required more than just money. It required a network of silence. Elias began tracking the missing files from the original 20100 investigation. He discovered that 4 other officers, besides Miller, had taken early retirement or sudden transfers within months of Leo's disappearance. Each one had received consultancy fees from a shell company linked to the Blackwood estate. The rot wasn't just in the soil, it was in the badge. He returned to the Blackwood mansion, now a cordoned-off crime scene. In the master study, hidden behind a collection of first-edition novels, Elias found a leather-bound ledger. It wasn't just a list of bribes, it was a diary of obsession. Mr. Blackwood had lost his own son to a terminal illness just weeks before Leo was snatched. The ledger revealed a chilling philosophy. He believed his wealth gave him the right to redistribute happiness. He had watched the neighborhood for months, scouting for a child who looked like his lost boy, settling on Leo because of the way he laughed. Meanwhile, at the hospital, the transition was agonizing. Leo, who still flinched when someone called him by his real name, sat in a sterile room, staring at the walls. Clara sat by his side, never touching him, knowing that even a mother's hug felt like a threat to a boy raised in a cage. "Tell me about the train," Leo whispered one night, his voice barely audible over the hum of the heart monitor. Clara smiled through her tears. "It was your favorite. You used to make the choo-choo sound before you could even say Mama. You told me the blue engine was the fastest because it was the color of the sky." A flicker of a genuine smile crossed Leo's face. The brainwashing was thick, but the core of the child was still there, buried under layers of Blackwood's lies. But the danger hadn't evaporated. The ledger Elias found contained a final, terrifying entry. "If the secret ever breathes, the foundation must be burned." Elias realized too late what that meant. He lunged for his radio. "Dispatch, get all units to the Blackwood evidence locker and the hospital now." But the foundation wasn't a building, it was the witnesses. As Elias raced toward the hospital, a black sedan forced his car off the rain-slicked road. He spun out, his vehicle slamming into a guardrail. Dazed and bleeding from a gash on his forehead, Elias kicked his door open. Out of the shadows of the sedan stepped the one person he hadn't suspected, the current chief of police, Sarah Vance. "You should have let it stay cold, Elias," Vance said, her pistol leveled at his chest. "The Blackwoods didn't just buy a child, they bought this town's stability. Do you know how many jobs depend on their factories? How many pensions are tied to their success? You sold a 3-year-old for a pension fund." Elias spat, reaching slowly for the backup piece in his ankle holster. "I kept the piece," Vance screamed. The gunshot echoed through the trees. But it wasn't Vance's gun. Officer Miller, The retired man Elias had visited days before stood trembling by his old truck a few yards away, a shotgun in his weathered hands. He had followed Elias, driven by a decade of guilt that had finally become too heavy to carry. Vance fell, wounded in the shoulder, as Elias moved in to disarm her. "It's over, Sarah." The silence is broken. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place with brutal clarity. The missing child case became the Blackwood conspiracy. Arrests followed in the city council, the police force, and the local judiciary. The town of Oakhaven had to look itself in the mirror and realize that its prosperity was built on the stolen life of a little boy. A month later, Elias stood outside Clara's house. The police tape was gone. The flower beds were blooming again. Through the window, he saw Leo sitting on the floor. He wasn't playing with the wooden train. He was holding a book, reading aloud to his mother. He wasn't the boy he was supposed to be, nor was he the Julian the Blackwoods had manufactured. He was someone new, a survivor. Elias didn't knock. He didn't need a thank you. He simply placed the original 2010 case file, now stamped closed in thick red ink, on the porch swing and walked away. The weight that had hung over the nursery for 15 years had finally lifted. The air was no longer heavy. It was just air. And, for the first time in a long time, it was easy to breathe.